Hello, everyone. I have 12 o'clock on the dot, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And welcome back to the 2018 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. This is Zach Grant here again, your local food systems and small farm educator in Cook County, and your weekly moderator and coordinator for this series. We appreciate you joining us once again for these webinars, and we will do our best to begin and end within the space of the lunch hour. This is a tight delivery period, as usual, for our educators to deliver their program, so please understand where we are limiting your questions to the text box over on the left-hand side of the presentation. I will do my best to make sure our presenters answer them as time allows or provide you with necessary links if I can. I have posted call-in information in the chat box if you continue to have audio or video issues. Additionally, you should have received the slide set for today's webinar in an email last night. This presentation is being recorded, and I will email a link to the archived presentation as soon as possible after the program concludes. So if we run over on time and you need to leave earlier, you will receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar and answers to any questions that are asked. There will also be a short link for a very brief online evaluation of this presentation, and we would very much appreciate your feedback as usual. This week's presentation is from Dave Shiley. Dave is my fellow local food systems and small farm educator housed in Coles, Cumberland, Douglas, Moultrie, and Shelby counties. In his role as extension educator on our team, he identifies strategies for educating the public about issues in local food systems and resource management on small acreage systems. Additionally, he works with local producers and clients considering alternative income production opportunities on small acreage and woodlands. Dave also serves as the state coordinator for our Master Naturalist program. Dave began his career with the University of Illinois Extension in 1982 as the camp manager and program director at the 4-H Memorial Camp near Monticello. From 92 to 2011, he served as the Natural Resources Management Extension Educator at the Champaign Extension Center, providing natural resources management programming and support for 21 counties in east central Illinois. In my discussions with Dave, he indicated that he has a family history in the Christmas tree business, so perhaps he can elaborate on that a bit more as we get started. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dave, and go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Zach. So yes, my folks did have a Christmas tree operation for almost 20 years. Very small. It was encompassed about 4 acres. As we transitioned from having some cattle on that acreage and then planting trees, both my parents had off-farm jobs, and so it was very rewarding, and created a place for people to create a tradition. So I think that's one of the magical things, if you want to call it magical, about Christmas tree production. And so today I'm just going to try to go through and give you an overview of things to think about as you look at Christmas tree production as an alternative for some of the land on your farm. In a publication from Nebraska, it's got some questions that I think, in addition to these, we're going to go through these business considerations, but it has some questions about asking producers, does this really fit? One of those questions is, are you willing to plant trees every April? We'll talk about that. Are you willing to shear or prune trees every year, every tree? Are you willing to control weeds and grass around those trees? Are you willing to devote time and energy in late November and December to marketing? Are you willing to invest land, equipment, and labor in a project that you're not going to see any income for at least 6 years? So it's a long-term investment. Will you continue to develop knowledge in Christmas tree production beyond your initial? It's an ongoing, any kind of enterprise, it's ongoing education. It really helps make those businesses successful, and Christmas tree production is no different. Are you willing to protect those trees from both fire and insects and disease pests? And are you willing to accept periodic heavy losses from things because we've got a crop that's growing over 7 to 10 years? There may be a drought or hail or other natural um, cause that causes a major tree loss. And then finally, do you enjoy tending trees as they grow? And one of the things that I really enjoyed, uh, on my folks' Christmas tree farm is shearing a tree. And so you're doing kind of two things. You're working with you're growing a plant, but you're also manipulating that plant to make it into a final product. And I got a lot of self satisfaction from doing that. So let's talk about location first. So considering the location are relative to the market, or maybe you're planning to purchase or rent land for Christmas tree production, or maybe you're going to utilize acreage on your own farm. So how close is that to your market? The location is really an important consideration for marketing, and also might determine the type of operation you have. If further are away from a concentrated client base, then you may need to harvest some of your trees and market those as wholesale products. Um, on your particular farm, the area you're considering, do you have enough available land? And is it well drained? It can't be an area on your property it's that low area. Really can't grow much else there. Uh, Most the conifers we're going to grow for Christmas trees, don't like their feet wet, so they don't do well in wet soil. So it may be something that may eliminate your uh, options in terms of the species of trees you can grow. For wholesale operations, again, doing some homework ahead of time. Uh, are there potential buyers in your area that do fundraising or retailers? So talking with them, finding out if they're interested. Do they sell trees? Are they going to continue to do that? The challenge is you're projecting it out 7 to 10 years. So, but currently, what kind of volume of trees are they using to gauge how many trees you might be needing to produce per year on a wholesale basis? And then, kind of the other side of that is, your farm's location might be suitable for a cut your own operation. And it's not always, it doesn't have to be right next to a large metropolitan area, but certainly closer is better. Um, if you're considering buying land to enter the Christmas tree production market, then of course the land closer to a larger city or metropolitan area is going to be more expensive. So, but you can use distance away from that uh, client to your advantage. So the selling point when someone comes out and goes to a tree farm to cut their own tree, they're really more than likely looking to do it as a family and as an event. And then your job as a tree farmer, Christmas tree farmer, is going to be to cultivate that um, with the client so that they continue to come back year after year. Signage obviously is going to be more critical if you're a little more remote, but it's certainly still not a roadblock for entering into the market as a cut your own tree farm. You might want to do a little bit of demographics of who are my potential customers. More and more people are buying artificial trees, um, but marketing, telling people the benefits of coming out in the country, so to speak, and having that experience you need to do a good job of telling your story. Um, and then what is around you? Are there any competing farms? An interesting thing that's happened with cut your own operations is that um, over the years, more and more of those have dropped out of the marketplace. In central Illinois, about a half an hour from where I live, there's an operation that's been in business for a very long time, big operation, and they have retired, and so we've lost another or cut our own operation. And so that uh, may affect you entering the market if there's, and we'll talk a little bit more about the considerations relative to, are there competing farms, or have there been some competing farms that have dropped out recently? Um, do you have space? You're going to bring people there for parking, sales, and is that close to where you're going to grow trees? Are all things to think about. Do you have enough space to enter the Christmas tree business? So let's talk about growing site a little bit more. So while marketing is an important consideration of your farm site conditions for tree growth is really equally important. Poor soil and site conditions are probably much more suitable for adaptable species such as pine. So if you're thinking, oh, I want to grow a lot of spruce and fir, because that's what people seem to like, if you have poor site conditions, if there's just low fertility and somewhat poorly drained, then there's some management things we can do to improve those site conditions to make the soil more favorable. If you've got sloping land, you may just have to learn to shear those trees. Shearing is pruning to shape that into a Christmas tree shape. It may be more challenging to learn on a slope. You may have to, may cause a little more challenge mowing. And then we'll talk a little bit more about shading from adjacent areas. So squeezing that plot of stand of trees within an area that has existing forest nearby. Might be your property, though if there are trees on the east, south, and west sides, they're going to impact growth because all of our conifers are very shade intolerant. So what about soil? So selecting the tree species to match the soil conditions not only will improve the growth of the tree, but it'll improve the quality of the tree. So trees may struggle and not die on a poor quality site, but you're going to develop a quality product, and that's really your goal. For a client to come out and find something that's high quality, that they maybe can't get somewhere else, is really the goal, to hook that client to come out to your tree farm. So the deeper the soil, generally, the more favorable growing site. We're looking at a tree. Texture and drainage. Soils with high clay content are going to be poorly drained. So remember, generally speaking, you want to avoid wet soils. Soils with high sand content, on the other hand, are going to be drained quickly. So there are a couple species that are not very drought tolerant. So you may want to avoid those if you live in an area with a lot of sandy soils. pH, Christmas trees are going to do a little bit better in that 5 to a little acidic on the acidic side, 5.5 to 6. And then those steep slopes not only make a challenge for management, but also water percolation and retention, and tend to be a little more prone to erosion. I'll mention on slope that when we talk about tree species here in a second, that the north, we have two different types of what's called aspect. So southwest and northeast. So if you look at a compass split in half, on a northeast facing slope, the sun's rays don't directly hit that, so it's a cooler, moister site than a southwest facing slope. So some species that aren't drought tolerant, you don't want to put them on a southwest facing slope if you're going to try to grow Christmas trees in a hilly part of Illinois. So let's talk about some common tree species that are grown for Christmas trees. And Scotch pine is kind of the king of trees, or has been anyway. It's most widely planted tree for Christmas trees. Its popularity has been declining over the years because as people's preference looking to a shorter needle pine. Scotch pine have you can see a tree on the left there. It's not been sheared, and then it's a sheared version of that tree. But they have needles that are two. All of our pines have needles in bundles. Scotch pine has two needles in a bundle, and they're somewhat stiff and rigid, but they've been around as a standard Christmas tree for a long time. There are different varieties of Scotch pine, so if you're going to get into the Christmas tree business, going to point out a reference from the North Central Region Extension publication it's several years old, but it's a great publication that talks about the needs, the site quality needs of these trees in particular. Um, and I just want to point out that Scotch pine, there are multiple varieties of Scotch pine. Some of the species, what they call French blue, tend to have that nice blue color, but their stem tends to be somewhat crooked in a lot of those varieties. So research those varieties based on their seed origin, and you'll see in this publication that talks about where that seed source is. So do your research, make sure you buy a variety if you're going to grow Scotch pine that meets your site conditions. Eastern white pine is a five needled, very flexible needles, also flexible branches. So there tend to be some customers don't like them because the branches tend to be hard to support a heavy ornament. But a lot of people, it goes back to personal preference. So a lot of growers will include white pine. They tend to grow like the Scotch pine on well-drained soils, but they will tolerate seasonally wet sites. Those soils classified as poorly drained, somewhat poorly drained rather. Um, so they'll do a little bit better in those wetter, if you've got a wet portion of the field, then that may be a block that you plant in white pine. Um, it's not as drought tolerant as Scotch pine. Scotch pine is a fairly drought tolerant species, so Scotch pine can be put up on those droughty locations. Those are the two common pines that you're going to see grown as Christmas trees in Illinois anyway. Um, in terms of fir, so fir and spruce have needles that are attached singly to the twig. They tend to be a little bit shorter. And so these three species, balsam, cannon, and concolor, are three commonly grown species. You'll see them in the marketplace in pre-cut operations, retail locations. So balsam fir in the north central region of the United States, it is really a recommended species for the northern portions. So if you're in southern Illinois, as an example, this tree species probably is not going to be one that you might find successful. The One of the things that happens in the southern part with all our spruce or fir rather is that they're early to flush out, to do bud flush, or the buds opening up. And if we have a late frost, or if that tree's in a frost pocket, then those buds will be knocked back. So it's a consideration with all of our fir, the species that we're going to talk about. Also, when you're planting fir, but it's especially important, but a pine would benefit from this as well. When you buy a seedling stock tree, so we're going to talk about planting in the spring, and a bare root stock tree, those trees that have, they'll be classified as, they'll have two numbers. The first number is relative to how old that seedling is, and then the second number is how many times it's been transplanted before it gets to you. So for example, if it had a 1 and a 0, then it's a 1-year-old tree, never been transplanted. So all of our trees, all of our fir, are going to do a little bit better if they are at least a 2-2, meaning 2 years old, 2 times transplanted, or a 2-3. All the fir is kind of a general rule. Uh, Cannon fir is actually a variety of balsam fir. Um, it's from a species that grows naturally in West Virginia. Uh, Cannon fir has two really important characteristics. One is that it will tolerate wetter soils than something like Fraser fir or balsam. It also appears to have a little more resistance to that spring frost injury that I mentioned with fir. So if you're kind of thinking that I've got a frost pocket that might happen on this slope, get trapped in this within my planting in the spring, then cannon fir might be one that you might want to try. They do prefer well-drained soil for the most part, do a little bit better, but they will do pretty well also on imperfectly drained soil. So they're one that will tolerate a little bit of water, but not wet. And then concolor. So concolor is kind of a new entry into the Christmas tree production. Um, it requires, like all fir, um, a fertile soil. So if you've got clay soil or low fertility, you want to do a soils test, then you're going to need to plan on fertilizing fir. Concolor has great, along with all the other firs, but really good needle retention after it's cut, which is one of the reasons people like it. It does grow better in the northern parts, in the northern half of Illinois. Probably we grew that in central Illinois. Concolor did pretty well. Um, and again, benefits from a transplanting stock that is like a 2-2 or 2-3 when you're planting. Quicker establishment. Douglas fir is not a true fir. It has flat needles, and it is one that it's a great Christmas tree in terms of client preference. However, it's a challenging one to grow. So Douglas fir is probably one of the most challenging Christmas trees to grow. It doesn't tolerate either excessively wet or dry soils, so it's got to have that perfect, well-drained soil condition. And it is also sensitive to that spring frost injury. So, um, orchard type sites that are probably ideal for this tree that have north to east facing, that northeast aspect, northeast facing slopes are pretty good. We grew some Douglas fir as well in central Illinois, and it does benefit from increased fertility. So fertilizing these trees just like you would fir are an important management consideration. And then spruce. So spruce are also single needled trees. They're attached singly to the twig. Um, Spruce, one of the challenges with spruce is that the needle retention isn't real great. So Norway spruce has been grown as a Christmas tree for a number of years. It has short, kind of dark green, sometimes blue-green needles. You can see it on the left side there. It also is going to benefit from increased fertility. So you just can't stick it in the ground like you might a pine and not fertilize it. The recent research on all the spruce is pointing towards not harvesting spruce until we get into the month of December in Illinois. And it helps on needle retention for the customer's tree in the house. So that may be a consideration if you're going to have some spruce growing on your farm, then at least communicating that to the customer. Maybe they could come out. It's very common practice for people to come out and tag a tree, and then come back later and cut that tree. So that may be something that you encourage customers to do with spruce, just so they have a better experience with that Christmas tree. With Colorado blue spruce, it's a very popular Christmas tree, even though the needles are very rigid and very sharp. Blue-green color is very popular with people that like Colorado blue spruce don't seem to mind that sharp needle. Um, they also are in that with spruce and fir, we're looking at a longer rotation. So pine, we're looking at a 7-year rotation to get a tree out of from planting out of the field. And with spruce, we're looking at more like a 10-year rotation. So they're all the spruce and fir are slower growing. Um, Colorado blue spruce will tolerate heavier clay soil and wetter soils than a lot of other Christmas trees. So this is another one that if you had some wet locations on the farm, within that plot even, then you could, section that off into a block that you're going to have produce blue spruce. And then finally, white spruce. So white spruce is another one that is fairly common. It's native to the north central region of the United States. Um, Needle retention is better than Norway, um, and probably a little bit better than blue spruce. And there are varieties. You can see the picture. The needles in this tree here are very blue-green. So there are varieties that you can get almost that blue spruce color in a white spruce. Um, these trees also are a little more tolerant of a wide range of sites, somewhat poorly drained site. Uh, we grew the white spruce on my folks' farm. Has got a perched water table, and the white spruce still did pretty good. So in the wet side, one of the other wet portions of their farm, it just didn't do quite as well. That water table is a little bit higher, but even with a fairly shallow perched water table, white spruce did all right. So this is that publication in the North Central Region, NCR 479. I encourage you to get this publication. It's available online, and if you're seriously getting into, going to proceed into the Christmas tree business, match your tree species with your growing site. Okay, and then shade. So I mentioned shade trees. You can see in this. The trees in the foreground here, this picture actually are harvested trees that this grower supplementing the trees that he has on the farm. But you can see some in the background. There's some shade back there. So just keep in mind that on my mom and dad's farm, we planted a windbreak when they first moved out there, and there was some shading issues as those trees got a little bit bigger. And what happens is you end up with a tree that has 3 good sides. That back side just doesn't get enough sunlight. It's a little bit thinner. Some people will tolerate that as to purchase a tree, but otherwise it ends up being a cull that you can use for greenery or wreaths or that type of product. So the size of the operation. So how big? Small farm, a small Christmas tree farm is considered in that 2 to 4 acres. And so for us, again, we had to kind of crowd trees. We crowded trees, which crowding would be at a 5-foot by 6-foot spacing. So 5 feet between trees within the row, 6 feet between the rows. When you have a mature 7-foot tree, the goal is to have the basal width of that canopy at about 60% of the height. So then you're looking at a 5 by 6 spacing, a 7-foot tree. Those trees are going to almost be touching because it's going to be 4 feet, maybe 4.2 feet in diameter at the base. And those trees need to come out of there to start touching, crowding each other. It's hard to prune them, shear them, and you also end up starting to get some shading. So block management. So block management is really just looking at you're setting up a portion of your farm as a stand. And I'm going to grow spruce in this stand. I'm going to grow pine in another stand so that they have similar cultural um, requirements, both fertility, pest management. All the trees are sheared and go through that rotation together and then removed at the end of the rotation. The few cull trees that didn't sell are removed, and then the entire area, you can either let it rest, and you can see that picture at the bottom there is really a field that's ready for those last couple trees to be removed. No one's ever going to buy those trees. And then site preparation can be done during that 8th year of rotation in the case of pines, or 11th year in spruce and fir, and then get that replanted. When I was talking to a grower down in southern Illinois, they had gone to a mixed stage stand uh, type of system, and he said that he would change that, going to a system where he removed all the trees because those older trees, in his experience, had transferred, caused some issues with insects and diseases, especially disease pressure from the older trees that were either in decline or had issues that only older trees are going to get. Um, and so he would recommend, removing all the trees and then starting over in that block rotation. So here's an example picture showing some of that kind of technique. So in this case, the blocks are pretty small. So the blocks you don't think, well, I only have 5 acres. Think about to put into trees. So think about dividing that up. In this case, there's a travel lane right in the foreground of the picture, and then so you've got an established stand on the far left, one that they're doing site prep to plant this in the spring, one that's established, and one that's well established over in the far right. Looks like it's about ready to come out of rotation, but just an example of that block system. So let's talk about marketing a little bit. There's a census of horticultural specialties in 2009 that reported 2,700 Christmas tree operations in the United States. About 75% of those growers sell cut your own operations or retail. 50% of those growers, though, indicated that at least some of those trees are sold wholesale. The growers surveyed indicated that in my phone conversations with local growers, that Facebook, in terms of marketing, how can I get people to find out where I am and what I have, and then also customer feedback, that Facebook was extremely important for them, and then also customer service. So that last little bullet there, growers' willingness to add agritourism features. You don't have to do that to be successful. A lot of growers do that, but make sure you do that all your staff, especially in November, December, when you're selling trees, are bought into customer service. So if they're not attentive, you have one chance for this customer once a year to experience your farm. So every point of contact from the person that's helping them in the field, cut down a tree perhaps, drag the tree out, load it up on a wagon or whatever system you might have, or someone taking their money back up at your sales area, everyone needs to be bought into high customer service. So again, I kind of talked about this a little bit, but what trees are commonly sold in your particular area? So it does vary. So what are customers used to buying? And perhaps last, November, December might have been a good time, but think back about, not only at a farm, maybe there aren't any cut your own operations nearby. So what are they used to buying at the big box store, grocery store, other retail lot, maybe at where the Boy Scouts or some group is doing fundraising? What are they used to purchasing? Keep in mind that those species that do take a longer time, longer rotation to grow, like Fraser fir and Douglas fir, they are going to command a higher both wholesale and retail price than pine. So you kind of get paid back higher value product. Um, the most commonly produced trees from that census, again, Fraser, Douglas fir, and Colorado blue spruce. And then I would say regionally that from that survey, it looked like white pine, balsam fir, and Scotch pine were important in Illinois. Noble fir is growing out west, and it's a new entry into the Christmas tree production industry in 2009, and it was a $250 million industry. But definitely, as I mentioned earlier, the customer preference is moving a little bit away from Scotch pine and towards shorter needled fir and spruce. So if your farm has suitable soil for growing those species other than pine, that may be something to consider. So what's it take to grow these in terms of labor and management? So we have planting requirements, intensive labor requirements during planting, shearing, and marketing. So the question you need to ask yourself is, where is that labor going to come from? Do you have family members that are going to help out, as we did in my case, or will you need to hire someone? And if you're going to have to hire someone, then training, especially shearing, is a really important thing. And then if they're going to help sell trees, again, going back to that customer service skills, going to require some training there as well. Planting is probably easier to train, but they will need to, that's an important step in a production system, getting that tree in the ground, good root to soil contact. To produce a tree, these are kind of the five main things that we're going to have to consider. Seed bed establishment is really important for pre-planting steps, planting. You're going to need to keep the vegetation. You're trying to grow this crop, which is a tree, so keeping other plants from stealing nutrients, water, especially during their growing, is going to increase the growth and quality of your tree. From mowing, and then shearing. Basal pruning is done usually in year 3, and that's when we're removing some of those lower branches to create a nice 8 to 12-inch handle or something that customer is going to put in their tree stand. And then obviously harvesting. So for pre-planting, the site preparation, again, is really, really critical for any kind of tree, but that would include for Christmas tree production. So we're going to do some fall site prep. We're going to either, depending on the previous land use, if there are woody plants out there, pasture, row crops, we may have to do less or more, but we want to use a non-selective herbicide either in a strip or in spots. If it's on a slope, we're going to mow vegetation in between those bands. Anytime you're using a non-selective herbicide, it will, if there's trees out there during the active growth period, early spring through midsummer, they can damage that chemical can damage the trees, so you need to have a directed spray. But we're going to establish that planting zone in the fall. Then in the spring, we can come back in with a non-selective herbicide. We can use disking, tilling, as we saw in that previous picture, as additional steps. But we want to remove that sod layer. Rutgers has 2 really good publications on site prep and plant pre-planting and at planting. So I would encourage you to take a look at Rutgers publications for that information. Here's the top left slide, looking at pretty extensive site prep they did. They removed all the vegetation in that planting block and then came back in. It's hard to see the trees, but there are trees planted in that kind of center area where the planter is gone. You see a mechanical planter there in the bottom right, and you can definitely see those trees. They left some vegetation in between they did some strip preparation, both in herbicide, and then did some tilling as well. um, and then came back in and planted trees in the spring. Both good examples of well-prepared seed bed. So how many trees can we get per acre? With that example, I talked about a 5 by 6 foot spacing, and you're looking at about 1,400 trees. Most growers use 6 by 6. That's equivalent of 1,210 trees per acre. You also need to think about what kind of mowing equipment do I have? Will it fit in that kind of spacing? You want to make it easy to get that task done because you're going to do a lot of mowing during the growing season. Uh, Tree species is a little bit uh, perhaps a decision that's a little bit irrelevant, but if you're going to probably more relevant to the size of trees. If you know that if you're wanting to extend that rotation where you've got some folks where you're really shooting for that 7 to 8 foot tree, then that 5 by 6 spacing is going to be crowding. So 6 by 6 or 6 by 7 is probably something you want to consider. And then when we're planting on steep slopes, we're going to plant on the contour because we are going to disturb the soil when we're planting. And then on gently rolling topography, you can run those rows up and down the slope. So planting isn't just a physically putting that tree in the ground. It requires some planning. So as you're considering your planting operation, you need to think about, especially in a new operation, what is your plantation going to look like? In this picture, you can see that there's short rows there leading over to a main travel lane. Some of your acreage isn't going to be taken up by roads and lanes. About 10%, you could estimate, of an acre, 10% of that is going to be used for travel lanes to get your customer from that location. In the top of that picture, those trees are pre-cut, again supplementing what that grower's producing to satisfy the needs of the customer. And then they're going to walk down the travel lane and across those rows to harvest their tree. Here's a couple of close-up pictures of those travel lanes. You can see the one on the left between the new block that they're planting and that established block. It looks like it's ready to come out. And then a contour example on the bottom left. So again, most of our trees are planted in the spring because those seedlings, those bare root stock is less expensive. If you have to replant, then a containerized stock can be used to plant into the fall to replace those trees that have died during the summer. Again, tree seedling stock sold by the tree age and the number of years that are transplanted in the nursery. So again, just to reiterate that, a code of, and it has a 2-number code. A 1-0 would be 1 year old, 0 transplanted, 2-3, 2 years old, 3 times transplanted. So the older and the more transplanted stock is more expensive, but it's sturdier, less likely to die and have some kind of fatality from in that first year. So quicker establishment. And when we're planting trees, we want to make sure that I see a lot of people not keeping the roots wet. So make sure they're in a bag. They're not just out in your hand, 3 or 4 trees where the roots are going to dry out. You can hand plant per person 500 trees per day per person. You can, with a machine planting piece of equipment, you can plant 6,000 to 8,000 trees per day. So most operations can get by with a planting bar. 1/7 of the trees are planted in a pine rotation. 1/7 of those trees are planted the first year, and then the following until all your acreage is planted, so you get on a continual rotation. If you're a new market, if new to the market, and there has not been anybody go out of business recently, then the recommendation is to plant less than that 1/7 of your total capacity the first couple years. But if there's a grower that's gotten out of business recently, then I would go ahead and plant um, the full rotation number the first year right from the get-go. So this is kind of an example of that. So if we had 5-acre operation, we were shooting for a 6x6 spacing, approximately 1,200 trees per acre. We take 6,000. We could grow 6,000 trees. 6,000 trees divided by 7. Our target would be to plant 857 trees per year. And so you'll read where it talks about recommending planting a little bit less than that as your market develops. Yeah, but definitely as your skills develop. So it's probably more the case with skill development. But make sure that if there's an existing demand already from a tree closure, farm closure, then go ahead and plant that 857 in this example right from the get-go. So for small to medium farms, this is an example of hand planting. Again, you're going to be able to plant 500 trees per person per day. Generally, you're going to work in a 2-person team where one person is putting a tree in the ground. It's a lot faster. And the other person is using that planting bar. That's a dibble or planting bar. It's got a straight blade on it. You are going to put that in the ground, move it back and forth, away and back towards you, pull it out. It's going to develop a slot, drop a tree in there, and then you move back from that a little bit, a couple inches, put it back in the ground, close the bottom of the slot first, and then the top. We always did it twice, not just once, to make sure that's closed. If you're planting into wet soil, you can have that slot open up as the soil dries in the summer, and then the roots dry up in the tree, seedling dies. So it's better to wait, delay planting with this piece of equipment or even with this piece of equipment. So a machine planter. So you can see that soil looks like it's not wet. It's creating a slot when these guys are putting that tree in that slot, and then the machine is closing the slot for them. But even machine planted trees into wet soil, you can see that slot reopen and have an increased loss of trees during the growing season. So pest management, lots of insects you need to kind of that can cause potential damage. Again, you need to learn to recognize these common pests and be prepared to apply an insecticide probably 2 to 4 times a year. You need to understand the life cycle. For example, bagworm, that is only can be controlled during the crawler stage in June, not this time of year. So you have to physically remove it. So learning and understanding their life cycle will help you develop that spray schedule for your plantations. Disease, so you have at your access the University of Illinois Plant Clinic to help you with disease identification. We have a couple things. Phytophthora root rot would be a little bit of a problem on those stands that are mixed age, the older trees, wet soil. If you have good growing conditions, well-drained soil, then and you're getting all those trees out of that block in a 7 to 10-year rotation, and probably they're going to be an integrated pest management approach to dealing with that disease. Needle cast, we have a couple of them, Rhizosphaera on blue spruce and also white spruce, and then several needle casts found on Scotch pine. So again, scouting, there are some fungicides that you can utilize to prevent needle cast, manage needle cast in the plantations. But scouting, getting out there and seeing what's going on. We also you may have problems with vertebrate pests. So voles, those are short-tailed mice. tall grass species, so mowing, um, and then a white-tailed deer, depending on, so, what are the populations, especially white-tailed deer, in and around your farm currently. What I didn't put on this slide are birds. Birds occasionally will, in the spring, when those candles or the buds are elongating, it's called candling. Birds will land on the top of that candle before it hardens off, before you shear it, and they'll break it off. And so then it requires you to do some training of a lateral leader to make it your terminal leader again. So if you just put if you have problems like that, experience that, put some taller T-posts, taller than the trees out in your plantation for the birds to land on. So it's kind of a territorial thing. They're landing there and checking out the neighborhood, so to speak. So voles, there are some chemicals we can use. Zinc phosphide, make sure it is restricted use products. If you're going to use that, make sure you read and follow the label. It has high toxicity, but non-chemical practices for voles. And voles will eat they're more of a concern with seedlings, your new 1, 2, 3-year-old trees. They'll girdle the tree, eat the bark of the tree. If you have a lot of plant material, if you're not doing a good job of keeping vegetation away from the trunk of the tree. So also mowing those areas adjacent to your plantation. If you've got a tall grass area, right adjacent to a planting area, a planted tree area, then those voles might make make their way over to your tree planting. And then there's some recommendations about constructing a predator perch to increase predation on voles. For white-tailed deer, they're one option is fencing. So deer are going to do two things to Christmas trees. They're going to browse them, and you can tolerate some browsing. They like to eat the softer natal trees. So they'll eat white pine, but they also do antler rubbing. Antler rubbing then becomes kind of intolerant. You saw those pictures earlier, because you're trying to grow a tree that has 4 good sides, ideally. And so antler rubbing is hard to tolerate. Electric fences can be expensive. There's a design, a 5 or 7, a slant wire design fence that is probably the most cost effective. That more information on fencing can be found at that Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management, and then Living with Wildlife in Illinois website the University of Illinois Extension has. But you want to get that fence. If you're going to put up a fence, this is an example of a slant wire electric fence. You see it's not very tall. You need to electrify that as soon as you put it up, even if you didn't get the entire area protected, because it's a training tool. So you might put that out to prevent antler rubbing September 1, and then remove that fence when you've got people coming out to your plantation during the marketing season. But deer can be a little bit of a challenge to manage. If you do have a tree that's antler rubbed, leave it out in the plantation. Don't remove it, as it's a communication signpost. They'll just rub on another tree if you don't have a fence. So, if they've already hit that tree, they've ringed it anyway, going to use it for greens of some kind, don't remove the tree. We found that removing the tree just encouraged them to go on down the line. If we didn't remove the tree, they'd come back and hit that tree again and do less damage in the long run. So shearing, here's a picture of a before and after white pine sheared. You're going to use a shearing knife, hand pruners early in the season, and then you can use power trimmer tools if you've got a large area. Make sure shearing knives are extremely sharp. Make sure that you wear protective leg guards and steel-toed boots. More than once that I hit my boot with the shearing knife. So you never want to grab a hold of a towel leader with your hand, but be extremely careful. I would encourage you, if you're new in the business, to go to a Christmas tree farm, a local grower, and get a little demonstration on how to shear. I'm sure they'd be glad to help explain how that's done and let you experiment with that a little bit. And then training of other people. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. So make sure that you're training and supervising workers and shearing. So fertility, remember spruce and fir, if you're going to grow those on low fertility sites, you're going to need to do some fertilization. Um, Use a slow release fertilizer. If you use some soluble product, liquid fertilizer, you want to make sure you're not going to it may burn the roots. So use a slow release fertilizer, and then irrigation. So in maybe most years our tree planting, you're going to lose 5 to 10% at the most of a planting from droughty conditions or poor root development, and but in a drought year you could lose a much higher percentage. So having an alternative plan for watering during droughty times is really an important thing to consider. So labor requirements, we talked a little bit about labor. This is just a timetable for, think about labor. What is it's going to take? You're planting in the spring, replanting in the fall. You got some maintenance throughout the growing season, pest management, mowing, maybe some herbicide application, insecticidal sprays, and then shearing is going to be kind of in the month of June, and then of course sales usually begin with cut your own operations a weekend after Thanksgiving. Give you an idea of equipment, and some of this equipment on a small acre farm, you don't need necessarily a motorized auger for fall planting. If you're going to plant container grown trees, you could rent that instead of purchasing it. And subsoiler probably is not going to be needed by everyone unless you've got tight clay soils you need to deal with. Maintenance equipment, string trimmer, just be careful with those around the new trees. You can cut off a tree, a seedling sized tree with a string trimmer if you're doing that as a way to keep the grass away from around that trunk of the tree. So there are some herbicides you can use in and around the tree to deal with grass. Hand pruning shears, shearing knives, leg protection. Make sure you purchase leg protection gloves. You don't need the motorized pruning shear unless you're getting up into that 7 acres or you're trying to do it yourself. Then shearing can be very exhausting. You're doing it out in the heat, and you're swinging that knife there, as you see those guys doing that, all the way around the tree. So make sure you take breaks. Learn to take a lot of breaks, and to get rehydrated. Eye protection as well. If you're using any kind of mechanical tool, you need to wear that. Sales equipment you don't need to buy right away. It can be a delayed purchase. You're towards the end of your rotation. A shaker that you can see in the right hand picture there, getting rid of all the dead needles. Baler netter. We didn't have one on our small operation. We helped people tie it down to the tree. We had twine, that type of thing, and we had saws that either they could use or we would help them cut it down. We also made a lot of wreaths. We didn't make roping, but they have Garland Makings. You don't have to do that. A Garland making machine helps you make it easier. Yeah, you don't have to. We never sold tree stands in our operation, but that's not a requirement, but something a lot of growers do. And then same way with the tree water. So these are all kind of optional things but we did have a few things that people could buy in terms of decorations, that type of thing. One of the things we also did was, when I was talking to another grower in Southern Illinois, we always had free hot chocolate. We had a popcorn machine. We had so something a little extra that didn't cost the consumer anything, and that helped build that connected, help their experience. So let's take a look at economics of production. So this example is from the Penn State production guide from looking at Fraser fir, and so in this case, this example is 2013. Their total expenses on 1 acre were $9,000. Remember, you're looking at a 10-year rotation. So that in this publication, it breaks out those costs per year, but those are total expenses. The return above your expenses depends on the price you're going to sell the tree. So what they did was they split it up into 2/3 sold as number one quality, 1/3 sold as number two, and only 80% of the trees of that 1,200 per acre. That's at 6 by 6 spacing approximately. Um, so you can kind of gauge where you might be in terms of, and these were wholesale. You could use the same thing for, you're going to have increased expenses for selling the trees if you had to hire someone, um, but you'd also probably have increased um, purchase price. Another example from Tennessee with using white pine for half an acre, their total income about almost 10,000, expenses about 2,500, with a net income of 73. The thing that I want to point out was the total estimated out-of-pocket cost, including their equipment that they had to buy, was almost 5,000. So really their net income was much less than that. But so just to give you a sense that there is a little bit of economy of scale, that you can't just do 1 or 2 acres. You got to kind of buy into Christmas tree production um, because of some of those fixed costs. And then taxes and insurance. So income tax. So obviously you're going to have some record keeping with this operation, and it's going to be over a period of years. Those expense records need to be kept for, not only for tax calculations, but to calculate the tree cost. I encourage you to take a look at recommendations. Are always to look at the federal tax IRS publication 225. Farmer's Tax Guide. Generally speaking, cut trees can be handled similar to the sale of timber. Um, so some of those costs can be prorated and capitalized rather. Uh, you need to keep the cost or the income from sale of wreaths, or if you sell any trees live, if you containerize trees and sell it as a live Christmas tree, then that would be a separate. You're not selling timber then, and garland. So make sure you check your tax expert or hire one. Get in touch with someone that is familiar with agricultural taxes. Property insurance, if you may have to add an additional building, certainly some equipment, make sure you update your policy. And then liability insurance. So liability insurance can be a little bit of a challenge. Make sure that you're communicating or trying to find someone that a company that has insured other Christmas tree or specialty crop operations. Most policies will probably exclude chainsaw use by customers to cut down their tree, and some make sure that they understand that your clients may use hand saws to cut down their trees. So um, an important thing to make sure you're covered. And then any other you're inviting people to your farm, so make sure you talk about liability insurance. There's some resources that Illinois Christmas Tree Association is a great resource. You can, if you're going to become a grower, you need to highly encourage you to become a member of this organization. There's the Penn State, Tennessee publication, that North Central Region 479 publication I mentioned for Christmas tree planting species, and then Rutgers, the two publications on weed control, both planting and pre-planting. Michigan State also has some great a number of webinars on Christmas tree production. Michigan is in the top 5 states for Christmas tree production in the United States, so they've got some great resources. But as always, any kind of a specialty crop, make sure you talk to, in this case, Christmas tree farmers in your area. And when I say in your area, if there's not one nearby, go find one. Um, all are going to be willing to share what they know. Don't show up on the second weekend after Thanksgiving or Thanksgiving weekend to talk to them. Go have them give you a lesson on shearing, pruning, what kind of pitfalls they've ran into, how they market, all willing to share that information. And then, just as I was talking about sharing, these farms shared some of their pictures with me for this presentation. So, with that, I don't know whether we have a minute or two for questions, Zach.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I have some questions written down that I curated as the presentation went along. It's being recorded, so people who had to get off got off. So we still have some people on. So I have a few questions related to both sort of crop rotational and grazing rotational questions. So I'll kind of ask them in a few different blocks here. So the
Okay.
first question that was asked was during the block management portion, and the
Yeah.
question was, does that have the similar disadvantages as monocultures and other crops, disease/insect pressure? So I think what they're getting at is when you're doing block management, do you run into issues that with a non-diverse rotation in those that block management strategy?
Yeah. You could. So what you'd want to do is have a mixture of spruce or mixture of fir within that block. You could mix spruce and fir, and then put pine in a separate block because your rotation length is going to be different. So, um, but when I talk to growers, the those older trees, unless you were aggressive about removing those older trees actually increase the uh, specifically with Scotch pine with pine wilt, pine nematodes causing pine wilt um, disease that increased with not pulling those trees out of completing a rotation, leaving them in there and planting around them, so to speak. So, but yeah, you would. I think the if you could mix up that variety of spruce and fir within that. But
So along those same lines, there were a few other questions about if you are resting blocks, is there anything advantageous to plant, like when you're resting, like alfalfa cover crops, tillage radish, maybe different small fruit species like gooseberries, currants, or are there any things that should be avoided during those rest years or rotational years?
yeah, so when you mention anything in the ribes genus, so gooseberry currant would be in some parts, and maybe in northern Illinois, and certainly outside Illinois, there's a disease called white pine blister rust, and that alternate host is the genus ribes from white pine. So you definitely wouldn't want to put those in there. Um, but I don't know if there's any kind of research to show, I think you're going to rest that to for site preparation. So if you could put a cover crop, intuitively put a cover crop that's going to add organic matter and nutrients to the soil, then that would be certainly be something to do.
What about mixing in other species like apples or other tree fruit species in there? Someone who asked one of the questions just added a little
Sure,
appendix to that.
sure, yeah. So I think that would. I don't know of any other tree species you necessarily would need to avoid. The Actually, there's another disease that's not very prevalent that goes from oak to pine, but um, it's a type of canker, and we just don't see that much in Illinois. Um, so no, I don't. I think that could be incorporated.
Okay. Um, and then there was a couple questions about grazing. Someone asked about suitable for grazing or pasturing poultry, and then someone asked about sheep for weed control. Another listener put a comment about sheep and goats being sensitive to pine and maybe some abortion issues with reproduction. So, any comments about pasturing between rows or in rotational grazing with animals within Christmas tree orchards?
Yeah, so for Christmas tree production, recommendation is to fence to keep livestock out because I think they would, you might do some browsing of the pines and maybe not necessarily good health, might cause a health issue with the animal, but also, again, you're trying to grow this tree that has few to little defects. So, generally speaking, the recommendation is to keep livestock out. So I don't think there'd be an advantage unless you could graze travel lanes. You could put um, during the summertime, you could run electric fence and let them run down those travel lanes, which could encompass, so quite a bit of acreage
Hmm.
out of your total. So.
Okay, great. And then one last question about planting patterns. So grid planting versus honeycomb planting. Is there any, so like, is there, I mean, are most people doing sort of just a standard orchard grid style planting? There's no different sort of alternative planting patterns?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. So you just need to think about, you know, uh, you helping a consumer or the consumer themselves dragging that tree out past other trees in the stand. So you want to you don't want to make it so that it has potential for reduce the damage to other residual trees or trees that are not been harvested yet. Um, so running a short leg out to a travel lane is going to reduce that probably, but um, and then spacing. If you've got the acreage going to a 6 by 8 spacing where you have more spacing between the row, um, then it's easier for people to get that tree. We had, in our case, when we were growing trees, they were long rows, so we used the 6 by 8 spacing so that we knew they were going to have to drag them down the row out to the end, um, and it worked out a lot better.
Okay. So one last question that just popped up, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Someone asked a question about slowly drawing back land from a farmer so they could start planting their trees. So would the continue plant rotation of corn and soybeans and all the pesticides and chemicals used in that planting area cause any problems for Christmas trees? That if you're so I think like maybe it's like a drift question mixed with
Yeah, and residual.
yeah.
It would kind of depend on what they're using, I suppose. But it would make sense. I mean, that's typically what a lot of people do that are taking land out of production. They're taking a little bit at a time. Um, the tree conifers can be affected by um, some of our agricultural herbicides from drift, but so I think you'd need to kind of think about that. How can you minimize that, both from the operator as well as leaving a buffer, perhaps? But
Right.
yeah,
So maybe just communication with the farmer and
yeah,
understanding what they're spraying and
mhm,
if your varieties have any sensitivity to that.
yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Dave, for the fabulous presentation, going in depth into Christmas tree production. And I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar. I hope you got some useful information out of this and something you can put in place for your future Christmas tree production operation. Look for an email from us for the link to archive webinar and as well as a short evaluation. We really appreciate any feedback you can give us to shape the future of our webinar. So with that, I want to wish you a fabulous rest of the day and a productive start to the rest of the season if we don't hear from you later. So thanks a lot.